My name is Olivia Cole, 52 years old, an active duty commander in the United States Navy. I just put down my credit card to cover a $1,200 bill for my sister's engagement dinner. That money was my hazard pay, saved up from dodging mortar fire in the Middle East. Yet here I am, shoved into the corner seat, right next to the drafty kitchen door. My sister's future mother-in-law glanced at my gray suit and asked my father what I did for a living. Richard, my biological father, took a sip of the wine I just paid for and smirked. Oh, Olivia. She just crawls under ship decks to fix broken radios. A massive failure, nothing like my precious Victoria. Victoria shrieked with laughter, playing with her diamond ring. They think I am a fool to be milked dry. They have no idea that their millionaire future son-in-law just caught a glimpse of the intelligence insignia I accidentally left exposed on the back of my phone case. His eyes went from arrogant to terrified, exactly like a rat realizing it shares a cage with a rattlesnake. Let me know which state you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been drained by your own family and thrown into a dark corner. Get ready to watch how I flatten their arrogance without raising my voice once. The sharp clinking of crystal glasses cut through the heavy scent of Victoria's expensive perfume. The cold condensation on my water glass soaked into the thick calluses on my palm. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. Prime real estate for dodging waiters. Back straight, eyes tracking the exits. A habit you do not lose. The waitress slid the black leather folder back across the tablecloth. $1,200. Cleared. Not a single person looking my way. Not a single thank you. Victoria was too busy leaning into Julian Vance, her silk dress riding up her thigh. Then came the insult. When the mother-in-law asked about me, Richard waved his hand. He dismissed my entire existence with a lazy flick of his wrist. Fixes broken radios. The words hung in the air over half-eaten plates of Wagyu beef. Victoria giggled, swirling her champagne. She is so rigid. No man would ever look twice. The table erupted, laughter, polite sneers. My chest tightened until it physically hurt. I looked at the wasted slabs of premium meat bleeding onto the white porcelain. All I could taste was the dry, choking dust of an MRE swallowed whole in the middle of a desert deployment. I set my ice water down hard. The heavy glass cracked against the wood. I stood up, leaving my phone face down on the table, and walked toward the restroom. I did not look back. If I had, I would have seen Julian Vance lean over. Julian buys and sells defense contracts. He knows the Pentagon's ghosts. His eyes locked onto the heavy scuffed metal coin embedded in the back of my black phone case. The crest of the Special Operations Command. The laughter died in his throat. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. I returned 3 minutes later. The loud dining room was dead quiet. Julian pushed his chair back. He stood up, ramrod straight, the posture of a terrified private. He ignored Victoria, pulling frantically at his sleeve. He looked dead into my eyes, his voice shaking. "Ma'am, there are men breathing today because of you." Richard's jaw dropped. The smugness drained out of his face, replaced by total blank confusion. I did not owe them a single word. I reached out, grabbed my phone, and turned on my heel. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked straight into the freezing, blinding downpour of the nor'easter. The nor'easter slammed against the windshield of my truck the entire drive back. Norfolk was a flooded ghost town under the blinding rain. My boots squished as I walked down the hall and unlocked my apartment door. No framed photos, no houseplants, just extreme sterile order. The air inside smelled like bleach and empty space. I peeled off my soaked, heavy gray blazer and slung it over the back of a metal chair. The kitchen island was pitch black except for the harsh, glowing square of my cell phone screen. 22 missed calls. Not a single text asking if I was hydroplaning on the interstate. No one gave a damn if I made it back alive. They only cared that I broke the script and walked out before settling the valet tab. The phone vibrated against the stone counter. Victoria. I hit the speaker button and let it ring out into the empty room. "What the hell kind of stunt was that?" Her voice shrieked through the audio, sharp and frantic. Julian is having a meltdown. He's locked in the bathroom talking about canceling our Paris trip to go back to the base. You ruined my engagement party on purpose, didn't you? You couldn't just sit there and let me have one good night. My jaw locked. My chest felt like it was packed with wet concrete. I spent my 20s in the sandbox pulling shrapnel out of kids' tactical vests and screaming coordinates over dead radios. My blood, my nightmares, and my hazard pay bought that ridiculous diamond on her finger. And to her, my entire existence was just a prop to ruin her spotlight. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just reached out with a stiff finger and hit the red button. Silence. 10 minutes later, the screen lit up again. An unknown DC area code. I picked it up. Commander Cole. It was Julian Vance. The smug, slick defense contractor from the restaurant was completely gone. The voice on the line sounded hollow. He was breathing too fast. I made some calls. To my guys at the Pentagon. They told me about the ambush last year in the valley. About the ghost who pulled that pinned-down SEAL team out of the fire. He swallowed hard. I could hear it over the line. He was waiting for a lifeline. I gave him nothing. Ma'am, I swear I didn't know. That is not my problem, Vance. I cut him off. My tone was dead flat. Frostbite. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the couch. The heavy rain hammered against the reinforced glass. I walked over to the refrigerator. Pinned under a cheap magnet was a faded Polaroid of Richard, my father, standing tall in his navy dress whites 30 years ago. He raised me to be tough, to eat dirt, take a punch, and never complain. Looking at his smug face now, the ugly truth finally snapped into place. He didn't make me strong for my own survival. He made me the workhorse so he wouldn't have to carry the load. I was the invisible bank account. Victoria was the show pony. I gripped the edge of the granite counter. I squeezed until my knuckles turned bone white and the cold stone bit into my calluses. I was done paying for their illusions. If you have ever been the family workhorse, the one who carries all the financial weight while they treat you like garbage, drop a 1 in the comments right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know I am not the only one who had to cut the cord. Decades of keeping my mouth shut. Decades of shrinking my own shadows so their fragile, pathetic egos wouldn't bruise. That ended tonight. I let go of the counter. I reached over to the bowl by the door and grabbed the heavy keys to my Ford F-150. I opened the door to the freezing storm. Richard was going to learn exactly what kind of monster he built by sunrise, 7 in the morning. The sun glared off the wet asphalt, blinding and harsh against eyes that had not closed all night. I slammed the heavy steel door of my Ford F-150. I walked straight up the cracked concrete driveway to Richard's house. I did not bother to knock. Military protocol does not leave room for hesitation. I grabbed the brass handle and shoved the front door open. The heavy wood hit the drywall with a loud crack. Richard was standing by the stove. He jumped. The glass coffee pot in his hand jerked, spilling black liquid across the red-hot electric burner. It immediately hissed. A bitter, burnt smell filled the cramped kitchen. He fumbled to set the pot down his face, flushing red as he scrambled to put on his usual mask of authority. "What the hell was that stunt last night?" he snapped. His voice was loud, trying to cover up his initial flinch. He grabbed a dirty dish towel, aggressively wiping at the mess. "Lying to your own family. Making Victoria look like a fool in front of Julian." "What exactly are you trying to prove?" I stepped forward. The thick rubber soles of my tactical boots hit the worn oak floor. Heavy, deliberate. "I coordinate combat intelligence," I said. My voice was flat. No yelling, no shaking, just ice. The veins in his neck popped. He threw the wet towel onto the counter. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Do not pull that rank garbage in my house. You are selfish. You always have been. Where was your precious combat intelligence when your mother had her bypass surgery? You did not even bother to show up. You left us to handle the hospital bills while you played hide and seek overseas. You are a terrible daughter." There it was, the ultimate guilt trip, his favorite weapon. For 30 years, that speech would make me shrink. Not today. My chest did not tighten. The harsh morning light caught my bloodshot eyes, but I did not blink. I closed the distance between us until I was inches from his face. I could smell the stale sleep on his breath. He actually took a half step back, his heel hitting the wooden baseboards. You never complained when Victoria kept secrets, I said, keeping my volume dangerously low. You never minded when she lied about where those designer bags came from or whose credit card she maxed out. Because her secrets are glamorous. They keep up the image. He opened his mouth, nothing came out. His jaw clamped tight. My secrets, I continued, had to be kept so that the men out on the sand did not come home in aluminum boxes. He stared at me. The arrogant, booming patriarch of the Cole family was suddenly just a small old man in a stained bathrobe clutching the edge of his kitchen counter. I was not absent because I was heartless, I said, emphasizing every single syllable. I was absent because I was pulling my team out of a pool of their own blood. But you did not want to hear that. You just wanted a failure of a daughter so you could feel big. A reliable workhorse you could kick around. I held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. I watched the reality sink into the deep lines of his face. He looked away first. I turned my back on him. I walked down the hallway, the sound of my boots echoing off the cheap drywall. I grabbed the front doorknob. I paused and looked over my shoulder. I will be at the Hilton Charity Gala tomorrow night. My voice cut cleanly through the foul smell of burnt coffee. Tell Victoria to brace herself. I pulled the door shut. The slam rattled the glass panes. The grand ballroom of the Hilton was a minefield of cheap perfume and expensive egos. I stepped through the double doors wearing a stiff navy dress, minimalist, cut like a uniform. Around me, the local elite swarmed the open bar, their silk gowns rustling loud enough to drown out the jazz band. Victoria intercepted me before I made it 3 steps. She grabbed my forearm, her acrylic nails digging into my sleeve. She smelled like heavy, sweet champagne. Do not embarrass me tonight, Olivia. Just stand in the back and keep your mouth shut. I looked down at her hand until she let go. I did not say a word. I stepped around her and faded into the shadows near a marble pillar. I scanned the room. Waiters, politicians, defense contractors. And then standing near the centerpiece, I saw him. Admiral Thomas Sterling, former head of special operations. Even in a tuxedo, the man looked like he was ready to call an airstrike. He caught my eye. Real soldiers recognize each other. It is not the clothes, it is the stillness in the spine. Sterling broke away from a group of local senators. He walked straight toward my dark corner. The crowd parted for him. As he approached, he stopped, brought his heels together, and gave a sharp, respectful nod. Victoria and Julian saw it happen. Panic and greed lit up Victoria's face. She dragged Julian across the floor, eager to scavenge the connection. A local reporter with a camera flash hot on her heels followed them, ready for a photo op with the Admiral. Admiral Sterling, Victoria chirped, flashing a fake strained smile as she pushed herself between us. It is an honor. I am Victoria. This is my fiancé, Julian. The reporter raised his camera. Admiral, a quick quote for the charity profile. Sterling did not look at the lens. He reached out and physically pushed the camera down. His jaw set into hard rock. You have the wrong person. Sterling said, his voice carrying the heavy, low rumble of a battleship engine. You should be interviewing Commander Cole. The color drained from Victoria's face. She forced a hollow, high-pitched laugh, glancing around nervously. Oh no, sir, you are mistaken. My sister just fixes radios. Sterling snapped his neck toward her. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. His eagle-eyed stare pinned Victoria in place. Fixes radios. The disgust in his voice was thick enough to choke on. Your sister is the intelligence officer who coordinated the dust-off that brought my son back from the dead in Helmand Province. The bomb dropped. Victoria's jaw unhinged. The red wine in her glass sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth next to us. The reporter's pen stopped moving. The silence spread outward like a shockwave. Other veterans in the room, men with silver hair and straight backs, turned their heads. They understood what Sterling just said. One by one, they stepped away from their conversations. They walked over. 4 men, then 6. They formed a half-circle around me. They stood at rigid attention, a silent, absolute submission to a higher rank. I looked at Victoria. Her hands were shaking violently. The entire fake empire she had built on my back was crushed into dust, and I had not even raised my voice. Across the ballroom, standing near the ice sculpture, Richard watched his golden child crumble. I did not smile. I just held my ground, surrounded by men who knew what real blood smelled like. The next morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, a heavy fist knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole. Richard was standing in the hallway, holding a cheap plastic container of grocery store cookies. Sunday morning, 8:15. Richard stood in my kitchen doorway, holding a cheap plastic clamshell of grocery store sugar cookies. The arrogance that usually puffed up his chest was entirely gone. He looked like a man who had just survived a car wreck. He would not meet my eyes. He set the plastic box on the kitchen island. "Victoria has been locked in her room crying since last night," he muttered. His voice lacked its usual booming authority. It was a weak, pathetic attempt to flip the guilt back onto me. I stared at the cookies. I reached out and shoved the plastic container across the smooth granite. It scraped loudly before stopping near the edge. "You want to know why I am always so cold, Richard?" I tapped my index finger against the stone. Hard. Rhythmic. Because my job is to sort human beings to keep them alive, and sometimes I cannot save them. I took a slow, deep breath. The air in the kitchen felt unnaturally heavy. "Marcus." Richard blinked, confused. "My fiancé," I said. "A Navy SEAL." Richard froze. His hand stopped halfway to his pocket. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I delivered the facts with the dry, brutal efficiency of a casualty report. "He died in a valley outside of Kandahar." The signal cut out. Complete radio silence. He bled out on the other end of the line while I stared at a radar screen, totally helpless. Richard's face turned the color of dirty ash. A month after his body came back in an aluminum transfer case, I continued. "I sat at your Thanksgiving table. I cut the turkey. I poured the gravy. And I sat there while you and Victoria laughed about how I was a rigid, unlovable spinster who was going to die alone." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. Richard's mouth opened and closed. "Why?" His voice cracked. He sounded incredibly old. "Why did you not say anything?" I stood up. I placed both hands flat on the cold granite counter and leaned in, closing the distance between us until he had nowhere to look but my eyes. "Because this family prefers a useless daughter over a war widow who ruins the fun, upbeat vibe of your holiday dinner." The words hit him like a physical blow. Richard's knees gave out. He collapsed into the metal bar stool, his heavy frame sagging. He buried his face in his large, calloused hands. The man who had spent 30 years demanding respect and absolute obedience was crying. The sound was ugly. A wet, choking gasp of pure shame. He stayed like that for a long time. I did not move to comfort him. I let him choke on it. Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes were red, staring at the floor tiles. "I failed you," he whispered. The words barely made it past his teeth. "I failed you completely." He slowly stood up. He did not grab the cookies. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, looking defeated. "I am meeting Frank and Arthur for lunch." He mumbled, moving toward the door like a sleepwalker. "At the diner by the docks. I want you to come, please." He walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. I stayed by the counter, listening to his truck engine start in the driveway. The diner near the Norfolk docks smelled like burnt bacon grease and cheap stale coffee. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The bell overhead jingled, but it was quickly drowned out by the low hum of conversation. I spotted Richard sitting in a corner booth. With him were Bill Frank and Arthur. 3 old combat veterans. Richard's drinking buddies. The men he always bragged to about his glory days in the Navy, even though he had never seen combat. They all wore heavy fleece jackets that smelled faintly of cheap cigars. As I walked toward the table, the atmosphere in the corner shifted. It was not a gradual change. It was immediate. The 3 old men saw me approaching. Without a single word spoken between them, the metal legs of their chairs shrieked against the scuffed linoleum floor. Bill Frank and Arthur stood up, all 3 of them. Big, heavy-set men with bad knees and bad backs rising to their feet in unison. They took off their worn baseball caps. They stood tall, bringing their shoulders back, and gave a sharp, solemn nod. Total, absolute respect. Richard did not stand. He sat there frozen, gripping his coffee mug. His eyes darted from his friends to me. For 30 years, he had tried to earn the respect of these men by spinning tall tales and buying rounds of beer. In 10 seconds, I earned what he never could just by walking into the room. He seemed to shrink inside his jacket, suddenly looking very small. I gave a short nod back. I did not smile. I did not sit down. Arthur looked down at Richard. His voice was gravelly and dead serious. My nephew was able to drag his buddy's body out of a firefight in Afghanistan because of the flight path she mapped out. Arthur pointed a thick, scarred finger at me. She kept them from being overrun. Frank leaned over the table, planting his knuckles on the formica. He stared right into Richard's pale face. Most men in this world would kill to have a daughter like her, Richard. You should know that. The words hit like a hammer. Richard stared at his half-empty coffee mug, completely humiliated. His performative patriotism had just been stripped away by the real thing. I did not stick around for the food. I turned and walked back out the door. 10 seconds later, the diner door swung open again. Richard hurried out after me. He stopped on the cracked sidewalk. Across the street, the massive steel hull of a Navy destroyer sat anchored in the gray harbor water. A heavy cargo horn blasted in the distance. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets. He stared at the wet concrete. I spent my whole life chasing the wrong things, he said. His voice cracked, brittle and weak. Silk dresses, big houses, image. I thought I was protecting the family by making sure we looked perfect. He finally looked up at me. His eyes were watering. I'm sorry, Olivia. I just looked at him. An apology does not erase the scars. It does not bring Marcus back. If you believe that a late apology does not instantly fix years of emotional abuse, type "too late" in the comments right now. Hit like and subscribe if you know exactly what it feels like to finally hold your ground. I opened my mouth to tell him we were done. Before I could speak, Richard's cell phone started ringing. It was a loud, obnoxious pop song. He fumbled to pull it out of his pocket and answered it. I watched the last shred of color leave his face. Victoria, slow down. What water? How high is it? Through the phone speaker, I could hear her hysterical screaming. The rising floodwaters from the storm surge had just breached the first floor of her luxury apartment complex. The power was out. The emergency exits were blocked. The apology tour was over. A real disaster had just hit. The storm surge hit Norfolk hard, turning Victoria's luxury apartment complex into an isolated concrete island. I slammed the brakes of my F-150. The tires screeched over the wet pavement before stopping short of the rising waterline. I threw open the door. The smell hit me first. Raw sewage mixed with thick, churning mud. The muddy water was already chest-high and rising fast. Over the roar of the flood, I could hear sirens wailing in the distance, totally useless. I stepped out. No rain jacket, just a black t-shirt and tactical cargo pants. Up on the second-floor balcony, Victoria and Richard were screaming down at the local police. The cops were understaffed, standing near a cruiser with a bullhorn, completely overwhelmed by the panic. People were crying. Chaos. I walked straight up to the rookie cop holding the bullhorn. I shoved his hand down. "Shut up," I barked. The tone left no room for debate. "Give me command of this perimeter. Right now." He opened his mouth, saw my eyes, and stepped back. Survival instinct recognized authority. The scattered rescue crew parted, leaving the space open for the only person acting with military discipline. I turned to the fire department volunteers. "I need 2 big guys. Bring that heavy nylon rope over here. Tie the end off on that steel light pole." I grabbed the heavy coil of rope and splashed down into the freezing, filthy water. The cold was a physical shock, biting right through to my bones. I tied the line around my waist. Up on the balcony, Victoria spotted me. She leaned over the wrought iron railing, hysterical. "Olivia, get up here, grab my poodle, and I have a Dior bag on the bed. It costs $5,000. You have to get it first." I stopped waiting. I looked up through the driving rain. Water dripped off my eyelashes. I stared at my sister. Even now, with people drowning around her, she was guarding her illusions. "Drop the bag or drown Vic." I yelled, my voice cutting through the storm. "I only pull human weight today." I did not wait for an answer. I plunged deeper into the current. For 2 straight hours, the freezing water pounded against me. I became a machine. Pull, drag, secure. I waded back and forth across the raging gap, hauling out 14 people. Old men, terrified kids. The thick nylon rope burned through the calluses on my palms. Blood mixed with the muddy water running off my knuckles, making the rope slick. I did not stop. Finally, I dragged Victoria and Richard onto the high ground. Victoria was shivering, her expensive clothes plastered in dark mud. Richard was gasping, coughing up dirty water, holding onto the hood of a police cruiser to stay upright. Overhead, the heavy chopping sound of helicopter blades cut through the storm. A local news chopper hovered above us, casting a blinding white spotlight down onto the muddy road. Victoria immediately flinched. She wiped the mud off her cheek. She frantically smoothed down her ruined hair, trying to look presentable. Her eyes darting around to see where the camera was pointing. I untied the bloody rope from my waist. I dropped it into the mud. While Victoria practiced her victim face for the upcoming interview, I walked past the paramedics and the flashing lights. I climbed into the cab of my F-150. I slammed the heavy door, shutting out the noise, and turned the key. The V8 engine roared to life. I threw the truck into drive and pulled away into the dark. I left them standing in the mud. The afternoon following the storm. 3 o'clock. The buzzer to my apartment rang. I opened the door. Victoria stood in the hallway. She looked like a drowned rat. The social media queen halo was completely gone, washed away by the muddy floodwaters. She was wearing a cheap, soggy velour tracksuit that rustled wetly as she shivered. She pulled off her oversized designer sunglasses. There was a deep, ugly scratch across the lens. Her face was pale, stripped of makeup, showing dark bags under her eyes. She did not say a word. She just walked past me into the apartment. I closed the door. The apartment was freezing. I prefer it that way. Cold air keeps you sharp. On the kitchen counter sat a mug of black coffee, bitter and completely black. Next to it was my Glock 19 training pistol, field stripped. Victoria stood near the kitchen island, shivering. She wrapped her arms around her stomach. She watched me pick up an oiled rag and run it down the cold steel of the slide, wiping away a speck of dried mud. The metallic clack of the slide locking back echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Did you really do it?" Her voice was thin. It trembled. What Admiral Sterling said. "Did you actually save those soldiers? Have you seen people die?" I picked up the barrel. I wiped it down. "Yes." The silence that followed was suffocating. My complete stillness seemed to crush her. For 30 years, her only defense mechanism was making noise, throwing fits, playing the victim. Now faced with a sister who had literally held life and death in her hands, her noise meant absolutely nothing. Her breathing hitched. A pathetic wet sob broke out of her chest. "I hated you." Victoria cried out the words, spilling over each other. "I hated you so much. You were always so hard, so quiet. You always disappointed Dad by not playing the game. It made him so mad. I had to be perfect. I had to wear the right clothes, date the right guys, buy the right things, just so he would not explode. I had to carry this family's image because you refused to." She was gasping now, crying over a burden she created for herself. I set the rag down on the counter. I looked at her. My eyes tracked over her shaking shoulders, her messy hair, her ruined sunglasses. A complete psychological scan. "Do you know what the most tragic part is? Vic?" I kept my voice low and completely steady. She sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her wet sleeve. "I never wanted him to admire me more than you," I said. She froze. "You spent your entire life running a race against me." I continued, leaning slightly against the cold granite. "You maxed out credit cards. You married for status. You stepped on my neck every chance you got just to win." I paused. But I never stepped onto the track. Her mouth opened, but she had no words left. I was too busy keeping the real world from collapsing. I said, so you could feel safe living in your fake one. The brutal plain truth hit her directly in the chest. Her knees buckled. Victoria collapsed. She dropped straight down onto the freezing hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands. The loud, ugly sound of her sobbing filled the apartment. She was not crying for attention anymore. She was crying because she finally realized she was nothing but an overgrown child playing dress-up in a world she did not understand. I picked up the heavy metal magazine. I slid it into the pistol grip. Click. I did not offer her a hand up. Sunday evening, 7 o'clock. I walked through the front door of Richard's house. For the first time in a decade, I did not have to pull out my credit card to pay for the food waiting on the dining table. The aftermath of the storm was still visible. The carpet in the hallway was stained with dark, dried mud. The overhead chandelier cast a weak yellow light across the heavy oak table. The house smelled like burnt garlic bread and canned tomato sauce. A cheap, quiet family dinner. No Wagyu beef, no crystal glasses, no audience to perform for. Victoria walked out of the kitchen. No silk dresses, no expensive heavy perfume. She wore an old pair of faded denim jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt. Her face was completely bare, her eyes swollen and red. She set a plate of pasta down in front of me. She did not look at my face. She did not speak. It was absolute defeated submission. Richard sat at the head of the table. He picked up a glass pitcher. He poured ice water into my glass. It was the only personal habit he'd bothered to learn about me in over 30 years. He set the heavy glass pitcher down. He stared at his large, aging hands resting on the wood. "I spent 30 years being proud of absolute garbage," Richard said. His voice was a low, hollow scrape. "Money, expensive clothes, looking good for the neighbors. I was bragging to my friends about a new boat while my own daughter was keeping soldiers from coming home in body bags. I called you a radio repairman because I was too small to understand what real duty looked like." He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small wooden picture frame. He set it face up on the table. The hard wood hit the table with a sharp clack. A faded family photograph from the summer of 1989. The three of us standing on the front porch. Richard traced the rough edge of the wood with his thumb. "I thought the loudest life was the most successful one. I was wrong." Across the table, Victoria kept her head down. A single tear rolled off her jaw and dropped into her food. She did not wipe it away. She just stared at her plate. I looked down at the photograph. I did not cry. It was a picture of a family, but it was missing the only person I ever truly wanted to build a life with. Marcus would never sit at this table. Apologies do not raise the dead. They do not rewind the clock. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor. I stood up and picked up my dark wool coat from the back of the chair. "I accept your apology, Richard." He looked up quickly. A desperate flash of hope lit up his tired eyes. "It is late, Olivia. The roads are still bad from the storm. Stay the night. Your old room is made up. We can talk." I pulled my coat over my shoulders. I buttoned the front. "No." I looked at him and then at Victoria. "You are my blood." But I do not belong here. I did not wait for them to beg. I walked down the hall and opened the heavy front door. The freezing night air hit my face clean and sharp. I walked down the driveway and climbed into my truck. I turned the key. The heavy V8 engine roared to life in the quiet neighborhood. I pulled out onto the wet street. I did not head south toward my apartment in Norfolk. I turned the steering wheel north, driving straight into the pitch-black night toward the silent rows of white marble at Arlington National Cemetery. Midnight. I drove south on the interstate, crossing the dark waters of the Potomac River into Virginia. The heavy, violent rain from the storm had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, clinging mist. I pulled my Ford F-150 up near the gates of Arlington National Cemetery. I shifted the truck into park and killed the engine. The heavy rumble of the V8 died away. The silence that rushed into the cab was immediate and total. It was not the suffocating, tense silence of Richard's oak dining table. It was the absolute, respectful quiet of hallowed ground. I opened the heavy steel door and stepped out into the freezing night. I pulled the collar of my dark wool coat up tight against my neck. I walked past the perimeter. In the pale, washed-out moonlight, thousands of perfectly aligned white marble headstones stretched out across the rolling hills. Row after row, mile after mile. Perfect order. Perfect discipline. No chaos. No lies. I looked out over the sea of white stone. This was my real family. I walked down the narrow paved paths. I stepped off the concrete and onto the damp winter grass. Dry, dead leaves cracked and crushed under the thick rubber soles of my tactical boots. The sharp, brittle sound echoed in the dark. There were no flashing cameras here, no charity galas, no cheap velvet tracksuits or expensive silk dresses. There was only the sharp smell of wet earth, wet granite, and the heavy weight of history. I knew the route by heart. Section 60. I navigated the rows without looking at the markers, guided entirely by muscle memory. I stopped in front of a curved white stone. I did not bring a bouquet of flowers. Soldiers do not need flowers. We just need the truth. I stood over the grave looking at the deep, carved letters cutting into the cold marble. Marcus. I took my right hand out of my coat pocket. I reached down and placed my bare palm against the top of the headstone. The stone was freezing. It was rough against my calluses. Real. Solid. I slowly traced the edge of his name with my thumb. My biological family had finally learned their lesson tonight. Richard apologized. Victoria submitted to the reality of her own uselessness. But the price of that victory was permanent, absolute isolation. I was completely alone. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely at peace with it. True sacrifice does not look like a Hollywood blockbuster. There is no swelling orchestral soundtrack. There are no cheering crowds waiting for you at the airport terminal. It is an ugly, quiet business. It is swallowing your own blood. It is keeping your mouth shut while the people who share your DNA mock you and call you a failure at a holiday dinner. You take the insults. You take the knives in the back from your own blood. You absorb the pain so that other families do not have to bury empty aluminum boxes. That is the job. That is what the hazard pay actually covers. I stood there for a long time. The freezing mist settled on my hair and the dark wool of my shoulders. I did not feel the cold. I felt lighter than I had in 3 decades. The massive debt was finally paid. The crushing burden of their fake plastic empire was off my back forever. I looked at Marcus's name one last time. Mission accomplished, I whispered. The sound dissolved into the cold night air. I took one deliberate step back. I brought my heels together. The soles of my boots clicked softly. I straightened my spine, raised my right hand, and delivered a slow, rigid salute to the marble stone. I stood my ground, a silent professional, watching over ghosts perfectly anchored in the dark. Thank you for listening to my story. Always remember, the strongest people often sit quietly at the edge of the table. Share this video if you believe silent sacrifice is the only kind worth honoring.